There's a question from our CEO.
Yes, thank you very much. I found that presentation very interesting, and I think it's also very important because I think this is an area where there is actually a dearth of understanding, and I think it's timely that we bring such analysis of the policy tools, framework, particularly in this part of the world where as some of the participants have highlighted, understanding is rather weak, and especially in countries and regions that are developing. And the question I have is, to what extent does this framework apply to different stages of a country's economic development? And particularly we are looking in Asia itself, countries like China, India, where I think the enforceability of the frameworks, legislative frameworks, of the control frameworks are rather weak. But at the same time, because they are starting from such a low base, to adopt a collaborative or consultative approach, you might actually end up in a situation where it's a race to the bottom itself. So I'm wondering whether you have to take into account the stage of economic development and also the kind of measures that you need to put in place to initially get yourself on a sound footing before you consider some of the other frameworks in place. Since someone also mentioned something about cars, I thought it was interesting that the other day I read that the sales of the Tata Motors Nano has been falling. In fact, it has fallen by 88%. The last that I saw it, I think it was last month's sales figures. And the reason is this, because when I was at a UN or at a Habitat Summit in India itself, New Delhi, Jaipur Reddy, who was a minister, was saying that the problem with car ownership in India is that the moment anyone in India feels that they have arrived, the first thing they want to own is a car. And at that point, I thought that that's very true, not only in India itself, but all over the world. But then, the difficulty right now is that having produced the cheapest car, nobody is buying it. Nobody is buying it because they don't see it as the sort of car which they aspire to. So they're actually looking for a better car. This is India itself. I think the same can be said anywhere in the world. You want to own a car, you want to drive it. And I think in the case of Singapore, we've managed to control the car population fairly well. We've prevented the massive congestions that you see in places like Jakarta and elsewhere. But at the same time, I don't think this has also filtered down to, and in a way, moderated those expectations of everyone who still wants to own a car. But of course, there you try an approach where you allow more COEs, everyone gets to own a car, but you just have to bear with slower traffic on the roads. I think that's a policy question that has to be considered, and there are also, of course, political implications arising from that. On plastic bags, we don't go around justifying that please consume more plastic bags because it fuels our plant and it can generate more electricity which can sell to the grid. Of course, we would like to encourage everyone to reduce the use of plastic bags because it consumes resources in producing those plastic bags. And if you can reuse them, then I think you don't need to use so many of them. And in any case, no doubt they don't end up in landfills, they go to our incineration plants. I thought I just want to clarify this point that the argument doesn't work that way in terms of this is how we justify the incineration plants. So maybe I could invite you to give your comments on the first question which I had. Thank you.
Sure. I was so caught up in your COE and plastic bag discussion, I almost lost track of it. It was about different levels of development.
Yeah, how this framework might apply to that.
And so what I would suggest is that the taxonomy itself is the same regardless of the context. And in fact, I'm less apt to insist that the constrained cost minimization rubric that I just described is the most important or the best approach. But I would suggest that it's been very helpful to us in a variety of contexts. And the difference is that the types of constraints you face in different settings and the costs, the relative costs, that is, how much different is abatement cost between different instruments, how much different is the administrative cost or the implementation cost or the public finance costs those are going to be, the actual evaluation of those is going to differ depending on the economic level of development. So you may look at this and go, look, this country simply doesn't have the capacity to implement marketable allowances. That's a high information requiring policy instrument. And this country can't do it. So the administrative costs would be very much higher relative to the potential savings in that setting. And so you apply those criteria differently, but the process is similar. Now, I have to say, the only place where I've really run into a huge problem applying this was in Azerbaijan. And that was because if you're familiar with Azerbaijan, it's a country that's renowned for, I'm trying to think, how do you say this politely? It's corruption. I don't have any other way to say this. And in fact, when I was talking to somebody, I said, it was one of my colleagues, very quietly, I said, so the corruption here's kind of a problem. He said, we actually had a joke that we were ranked number 2 in the world for corruption. And then we bribed our way into number 1. But I didn't know what to do in terms of policy instruments in a setting where there is no rule of law. Imperfect rule of law, imperfect enforcement, these sorts of things I can deal with. But to say, what's the role of government in environmental protection when there is no rule of law? I suppose it's that you say we need to do more education and perhaps more subsidies, but even the use of subsidies can be terribly perverted. And so, your point is well taken, but I think the answer is that the evaluation criteria get applied differently in different contexts.
Professor, my name is George. I'm from PUB. I'd like to use a real life example.
Oh, I'm an academic. I don't do real.
Okay, hypothetically, right? We have applied a cocktail of policy instruments, right, to water conservation. My question really is, how do we know that we have found the right mix, the sweet spot? Do you have a framework, an approach, where you know that the mix of policy instruments that you apply is the most effective? Let me just drill down a little bit on water conservation. We have 3 key approaches. One is pricing. So we price water to reflect its scarcity. Everybody pays the same price. For the lower income group, there are subsidies, but generally we price the water at one price. So pricing is one approach. Next is we have some mandatory rules on water wastage. We have rules that stipulates what kind of flushing systems, what kind of taps you can use. We have a mandatory labeling scheme for fittings and washing machines and so on. So there are some rules and regulations. So pricing is one, mandatory rules and regulations is another one. And the third approach is education. Right? Where from schools, households, we educate, we get volunteers to help to spread the message, the importance of water conservation and so on. So we've got all these instruments all acting together. Now how do we know that this is the right mix and where we should leverage more on which particular area we need to increase our efforts?
The starting point, actually, the real response is you don't. But the starting point would be, do we see common sense actions that people are not taking? Do we think we are at what an economist would call the production possibilities frontier? That is, we're using these resources. We've got water, and we've got capital input and labor input or effort. And the combination of those two, is it delivering the most services it can? And if it's not, then there may be room for improvement. And so, as I'm listening to what you're doing, what you're describing, you say, okay, well, we've got the price right. As I understand, water here is priced at marginal cost of production.